Hey everyone, welcome to this explainer. We hear about air quality indices, parts per million, and winter smog literally every single year. But we rarely step back to look at the actual legal and bureaucratic machinery designed to protect our lungs. So today, we're popping the hood. We're going to look at how India's environmental protection engine is actually built, funded, and run. We're breaking down the Foundational Air Act of 1981 and its accompanying 1982 rules. Our goal here is to examine exactly how this massive system was architected from the ground up, moving from its broadest nationwide powers all the way down to the nitty-gritty of how it tracks and justifies every single rupee it spends in the fight against pollution. Now, to really understand this machinery, we have to look at why it exists in the first place. This massive legislative effort didn't just happen in a vacuum, right? It wasn't just a localized idea. The legal text actually directly cites India's participation in the 1972 UN Stockholm Conference on the Human Environment. This was a pivotal moment in modern history. It was a true global awakening, and India committed on the world stage to take concrete steps to preserve natural resources, which specifically included preserving the quality of our air. That international promise, combined with the urgent need to prevent unchecked industrial damage, is the very foundation of the legislation we're exploring today.
Okay, let's dive right into this. Here is our roadmap for the explainer. First, we'll look at the AIR Act framework, then the powers of the boards. After that, we'll get into board meetings and procedures, experts and temporary associations, and finally, budgets and accountability. Let's get to it.
Starting off with Section 1, the AIR Act framework, and how this whole foundation was built.
When we look at the 1981 Act, it's absolutely essential to view it not just as, some loose set of environmental guidelines. It is a rigid, highly specific blueprint for fighting pollution. It's basically the structural steel of India's environmental governance. The core mandate is straight to the point: the prevention, control, and abatement of air pollution. But the absolutely crucial part of this definition is the second half: establishing boards to carry out these purposes. Before this, the machinery to enforce clean air just didn't exist in such a formalized way. The Act recognized that you can't just pass a law and hope for the best. You need dedicated, specialized bodies. It officially empowered the central and state boards to tackle air pollution head-on, giving them the actual legal teeth required to enforce the rules on a national scale.
Moving on to Section 2, the powers of the boards. Essentially, who is actually in charge?
If these boards are the engine of environmental protection, we need to know who's holding the steering wheel. The Act actually splits this up beautifully. On one side, you have the Central Pollution Control Board, or CPCB. They are the overarching architects. They plan the nationwide programs, coordinate activities between states to resolve disputes, and lay down the ultimate master standards for overall air quality. On the other side, we have the State Pollution Control Boards, the SPCBs. These guys are the vital, boots-on-the-ground executors, and this is where the industry's role becomes absolutely critical. Plants and factories are legally bound to comply with the specific emission standards set by these state boards. The SPCs are the ones physically out there inspecting industrial plants at all reasonable times and assessing local air quality. And if a state board inspects a plant and finds a violation of the Air Act, boom! They have the statutory provision to take immediate action. This includes the power to enforce heavy penalties or literally shut down non-compliant operations entirely. So the center strategizes the war on pollution, but the state executes the actual battles.
Okay, Section 3, board meetings and procedures. What I like to call the vital drumbeat. Because let's face it, a blueprint is completely useless if no one ever meets to look at it. The Act strictly dictates the rhythm at which these boards must operate. By law, a board has to meet at least once every 3 months. They cannot just go dormant for a year. Furthermore, ordinary meetings require 15 clear days' notice. This ensures all voices are heard, scientific data is thoroughly reviewed, and long-term decisions aren't rushed. But the Act is very pragmatic, too. It accounts for real-world crises. Think about a severe industrial accident or a sudden hazardous smog blanket settling over a city. If the chairman deems the business urgent, a meeting can be convened with just 3 days' notice. This specific structure ensures the bureaucratic machinery can pivot immediately to handle severe violations or emergencies. It perfectly balances deliberate, careful planning with rapid response times.
That brings us to Section 4, experts and temporary associations. Basically, how do they hire outside help? Now, what's really interesting about this is that no single board can possibly know everything about every industrial process. It's just not possible. So they legally have to bring in outside scientific or technical expertise. Looking back at the historical context from the 1982 rules, we see exactly how these temporary associations were compensated. If the board brought in an expert who resided in Delhi, they received an allowance of 50 rupees per day of actual meeting attendance. For a non-resident, it was 75 rupees per day, plus a travel allowance matching a grade 1 officer of the central government. Now, I know 50 rupees today might barely buy you a nice cup of tea, but back in 1982, this was a very specific, highly calculated expenditure to maintain strict fiscal discipline. It brilliantly grounds this bureaucracy in tangible reality, showing just how precisely the legislation dictated the spending of public funds.
And speaking of funds, the law was incredibly strict about accountability, especially regarding politicians. If a member of parliament was also sitting on the board or a committee, they could only claim these travel and daily allowances under very specific, tightly controlled conditions. Parliament could not be in session, and the member had to produce a formal certificate proving they hadn't drawn allowances for the exact same journey from any other government source. This rigid rule ensured that environmental governance couldn't be used as a slush fund or an opportunity for double dipping. It built fundamental public trust into the act right from day one. Which leads us perfectly into Section 5, Budgets and Financial Accountability. Time to show the receipts. And this brilliantly illustrates the most specific checks and balances of the entire framework, how the money is actually tracked. The 1982 rules dictated the Central Pollution Control Board budget estimates using a mandatory legal form. This isn't just some casual spreadsheet. Notice the extreme level of exactness demanded here to prevent any arbitrary spending. It requires actuals of the past 3 years, sanctioned estimates, actuals for the last 6 months, revised estimates, and variations. The whole shebang. This meticulous reporting standard ensures that every single projected cost is heavily justified by historical data and past performance. You couldn't just invent a number. You had to mathematically prove why you needed the funding.
Diving even deeper into the financial reporting, the annual statement of accounts required absolute compartmentalization. The board couldn't just write down a blanket term like pollution control expenses and call it a day. No way. They had to list out absolutely everything. They had to document the running and maintenance of vehicles, the specific costs of the board laboratory, scientific instruments, fees paid to outside consultants, and crucially, fees for audit. Literally, every single rupee spent by the board to execute its sweeping powers is compartmentalized, audited, and tracked for the public record.
So all of these rigorous financial forms, expert associations, and regular meetings culminate in the final, ultimate reporting accountability funnel, the annual report. The deadlines here are absolute. The Central Board must submit this full account to the central government within 4 months of the financial year's end. Then, the government is legally required to lay it before both houses of Parliament within 9 months. But what makes this report truly powerful is its contents. Beyond the budget, it mandates absolute transparency on their capabilities, detailing their exact staff strength, and it tracks their actual regulatory actions. Specifically, it lists out the operational consents they issued or refused to industries. Think about that. This functions almost like an early public citizen charter. Parliament, and by extension you, the public, gets a transparent, undeniable ledger of exactly which industries were playing by the rules and which ones had their operations legally shut down due to violation.
So we've spent this explainer looking at a highly structured, meticulously detailed, and largely paper-based system that was architected in 1981 and 1982 to arm a nation against pollution. And it clearly laid a phenomenal foundation for bureaucratic accountability, inspections, and public tracking. But here is what I want you to ask yourself as we wrap up. With the framework this rigid, built back in the early 1980s, is it fully equipped to handle the rapid, incredibly complex, and highly industrialized environmental crises we face today? How must this massive machinery evolve to keep our air clean in the 21st century and beyond? It's a huge question. Thank you so much for joining me on this deep dive into the legal engine of environmental protection. Keep questioning, keep learning, and I'll catch you in the next explainer.